Welcome.
Welcome. Welcome to Hopkins on the Hill.
Welcome to Hopkins on the Hill at home.
Hopkins on the Hill is a single-day event in our nation's capital. It's where we come to demonstrate the knowledge and the findings from federally funded research of Johns Hopkins faculty. This year, we're bringing the event from our homes to yours. It's a unique opportunity to allow everyone to access Hopkins on the Hill at home from wherever you are in the world. And you can join our conversation on Twitter with the hashtag Hopkins on the Hill, the hashtag Hopkins at Home, or at Hopkins at Home. So as we get started in this first session of Hopkins on the Hill at Home, we welcome the representative of Maryland's 5th Congressional District, the Dean of the Maryland delegation, and the House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, to talk about the importance of Hopkins in the realm of research.
Hello, I'm Congressman Steny Hoyer, representative from Maryland's 5th District and the House Majority Leader. I was honored to join you in 2019 in person, and I'm so glad to be with you again to learn about the cutting-edge research and innovation taking place in our state at the Johns Hopkins University. While we cannot meet face-to-face this year, that does not diminish the importance of bringing the Maryland delegation together with the Johns Hopkins community to discuss the impact of federal funding on research into aerospace, computing, healthcare, and other critical fields. The Johns Hopkins University is not only one of the most celebrated research institutions in our country, it is one of the premier research institutions in the world. I continue to be awed by the quality and breadth of research and development at Johns Hopkins, which benefits our state, our country, and all of humanity. Just as I am always so impressed by the extraordinary research and learning taking place, very frankly, at my alma mater, not far away, the University of Maryland. And I am proud of the work that my colleagues and I in the Maryland delegation have done to help you secure federal funding to sustain and expand the research being highlighted today. Working together with President Daniels and with the extraordinary Cybele Bjorklund, your Vice President for Federal Strategy, this partnership between the university and our congressional delegation has led to nearly $3 billion in federal funding each year for research taking place at Johns Hopkins and in our state of Maryland. I look forward to continuing to work closely with my colleagues to make certain that Johns Hopkins and other Maryland research institutions can access robust federal research funding so that our state can continue to attract and create good jobs and lead our country and the world in innovation and the development of new technology. That is so very critical for our success in the 21st century. I want to thank all of you again who are participating in this year's Hopkins on the Hill at home. This year at home, next year I hope we'll be together again on Capitol Hill. Thank you and Godspeed.
Well, thank you, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer. So today we welcome Cybele Bjorklund, the Johns Hopkins University and Medicine Vice President for Federal Strategy, and Denis Wirtz, the Johns Hopkins Vice Provost for Research. Welcome, guys. It's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So today we are going to go ahead and pull back that curtain on federal funding to learn more about how this process works, from Congress appropriating funds to collecting data in the field, and really learn how we use these dollars to improve lives and livelihoods. So Cybele, I want to start with just a simple question. Where does federal funding for research come from?
So thanks, Carrie. In the broadest sense of the funding process, it comes from taxpayers. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution specifically gives the power of the purse to Congress, and they decide on behalf of their constituents who have paid taxes into the federal government the levels of funding for federal agencies every year. Moreover, they provide direction in terms of where and how the money should be spent. So research falls into the bucket of discretionary spending. These are funding decisions made on an annual basis and sometimes on an emergency basis. Programs like defense, arts and museums, science and research, higher education, many programs fall into this category. Last year, the total discretionary spending was about $1.4 trillion. The Office of Management and Budget, along with federal agencies, draft reports and budget requests to send to Congress. These are incorporated into the president's budget, and that typically kicks off the appropriation season, usually around the second Monday in February. That said, new administrations take some time to assess their priorities, which are generally reflected in their budget. And so that date doesn't always hold in an election year or a year following the election. This year, President Biden has released the so-called skinny budget for discretionary spending, but the full budget has not been released. The House and the Senate each have committees on the budget who oversee the crafting of the overall budget agreement or outline, including spending limits, while the committees on appropriations in each chamber oversee the fulfillment of discretionary funding once a top line number is reached by the budget committees. And the House and Senate appropriations committees are each divided into 12 subcommittees, and those make the funding decisions for their respective portfolios. So one, for example, oversees the entire Department of Defense, while another subcommittee oversees the Departments of Labor, Education, Health and Human Services in one bill. And it goes down the line like that.
So, Cybele, you noted that President Biden's skinny budget was put out there. So now what does Congress do with the priorities set forth in that budget? How does that budget, the president's budget, fit into congressional processes?
So as I mentioned, the release of the president's budget sort of kickstarts the process on the Hill. And after it's released, the budget process starts in earnest, and with the crafting generally of a bicameral budget resolution. That resolution actually is not sent to the president and signed into law, but it is used to then guide all the appropriations committee's work. The appropriations committees then hold hearings with the agencies in the respective subcommittees to understand the requests that are coming from the administration. And this is a chance for the members of Congress on the committees to grill agencies on issues important to the nation, issues that are important to their districts or states, and projects or priorities of the agencies or some of their constituent organizations at home. Also around this time, groups of all types representing a wide array of issues and constituencies start to meet with members and their staff on the Hill to advocate for funding requests of all shapes and sizes. This is something that we Hopkins engage on behalf of our faculty and support our faculty going down there to talk with the appropriations subcommittee staff, members of our delegation, and others to reinforce why we're making the request we make and what we hope to see in a bill. Once the hearings are finished, the 12 House and Senate appropriations subcommittees each write their bills to allocate funding in their jurisdiction. And the process to finding a path to enactment gets underway. At the risk of sounding like the old Schoolhouse Rock song, the bill goes to the full committee for consideration and potential amendments. So at each step in the way, there can be modifications from what was originally put together. And once the subcommittee passes out of the full committee, it goes to the floor of the chamber for a vote. Once each chamber finishes its work, the relevant House and Senate committees come back together to negotiate and reconcile differences and have a unified bill. And then a final bill known as conference agreement is passed by both chambers and signed into law by the president.
So, Cybele, never apologize for referencing Schoolhouse Rock. I mean, that is how so many people just know the basic flow of this process. An amazing piece of communication for children to really learn that. I mean, that was my start in understanding this process. But let's talk a little bit now about when the government shuts down because there isn't an agreement on the budget. What happens there?
Well, and so the process I just described really does take the better part of a year. Technically, the federal government runs on October 1 to September 30th fiscal year. So we are supposed to have all the funding done by September 30th. That rarely happens anymore. Not sure that I can think of a time in the recent past, meaning decade or two, that it's all happened on time. And appropriations bills are some of the few must-pass pieces of legislation every year. So when it's not done by the end of the fiscal year, Congress needs to pass what's called a continuing resolution, or a CR, that keeps the government open and federal employees paid until a compromise can be reached. If a CR expires before the appropriations process is complete and another one is not passed, the government shuts down. And while shutdowns used to be quite rare, they have become increasingly common in recent years for a variety of reasons. And what that means is federal employees, with the exception of those who are deemed absolutely necessary, and federal services all come to a halt during a shutdown. And a shutdown can be as brief as a day or two, or they have dragged on for weeks. This is a time where some people might have experienced when they've gone to see a federal park and there's a sign up saying the national park is closed. There are more significant ramifications as well, but that's one that becomes very visible, especially here in the DC area where there are a lot of national park grounds around. What has become the typical practice is the use of so-called omnibus packages, which combine several, many, or even all appropriations bills into one or two large bills at the end of the year. And indeed, the last time that separate bills were passed to fund the government was fiscal year 2006. And those were all enacted between August and December of 2005. So even in that posture, we had continuing resolutions helping to support the process after October 1st. Those omnibus vehicles are must pass, as I mentioned, and other legislative items often try to hitch a ride on those vehicles. So a prime example of this is the COVID relief package in December. The COVID deal, which had to get passed, was coupled together with an omnibus version of appropriations and a slew of other legislation, resulting in a massive bill. So once the agencies receive their funding and direction from Congress, at whatever point that happens between September and December, or sometimes into January or February, depending on how long the continuing resolution is running, they start to execute on the agenda reflected in the budget that was given to them. And from a research perspective, that means the agencies can start putting the call out for competed grants and other types of research projects.
Okay, so this is where I come in then as a researcher. I see those announcements that are posted by the federal government on a website called grants.gov. And then I figure out which of those announcements fit me and my team and my research interests. And I think about applying for them. And Denis, you're also a researcher. And as the Vice Provost for Research, you are responsible for building the infrastructure within Hopkins that makes the faculty really competitive for those grants. So tell us a bit about how faculty apply for grants.
Thank you, Carrie. Well, let me start by dispelling a bit of a belief in some corners that the government really doesn't throw piles of money at scientists to do whatever they want with it. Federal grants are really highly competitive, selective, and regulated work. Let me highlight that unlike industry, the federal government is really the only source of R&D funding that will allow for risk and funds work that might not pay off, at least immediately. There are many steps for grant application. So what are those steps? First, the federal agencies such as NIH or the National Science Foundation will first put out a notice of funding opportunity announcement. This will include the requirements and information needed for an applicant to see whether they might qualify for this opportunity or project. So it also starts with applicants having to register to even apply in the first place, which may take a significant amount of time and information to complete just that step. The application itself can often be massive, hundreds of pages, and can take weeks, if not months, to complete. So researchers must not only develop the hypotheses, the theories, the ideas, and justify them, but provide detailed budgets and budget justifications and estimates about staff, equipment that will be needed to accomplish the goals of the proposal.
So once that application is submitted to the government, this interesting process then takes place for reviewing that grant that I think is a bit unique to research. So can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yes, so once know that proposal is submitted, and a lot of work went into that to start with, then really comes the nerve-wracking waiting period for us researchers while the agency reviews your proposal. For the initial screening, the agency first reviews to make sure the proposal meets the basic requirements and budget for the project. Then independent experts will assess applications using a scoring system typically established by each agency, typically with a review panel of at least 3 peer reviewers to assess and score project independently. Then the panel will convene to discuss the applications, monitored overall by agency staff to ensure objectivity. As an important point, these reviewers have to disclose any potential conflict of interest, and staff at these agencies scrutinize indeed any potential such conflict of interest. And then the panel, of course, give the recommendation and scores to the agency.
So it's very interesting. I had wise mentors tell me that you have to celebrate the submission of the grant, because after that, it's really out of your hands, right? And as someone who's been on both sides, as I'm sure you have, where you're both an applicant and a reviewer, it's a tough process. It is a rigorous, tough process with this peer review element. So celebrating that submission might be the most celebration you get, as we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Actual success is quite rare, actually. It takes a number of attempts. But let's say this grant review process has now ended, the peer reviews are in. Is the grant just automatically funded?
Well, before I go there, so true. We, in my own group, celebrate the small and big things, and includes submitting a grant proposal. Often they involve large teams of faculty distributed at Hopkins and beyond, and just achieving this get together, all the paperwork that goes into an application is enough ground for celebrations indeed. So no, the agency really has the final say, with input from those reviewers in awarding the grant. So if your proposal is indeed chosen, you receive a notice of award, always a good moment, which is really a legally binding insurance. When you accept that grant, you're then legally obligated to carry out the terms and conditions of the grant. So for every grant awarded, to be clear, there are many, many proposals that are never awarded. For example, the primary source for cancer research is the National Cancer Institute. I do cancer research. Well, the funding rate of a standard grant at the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, is just about 10%, often less than that. So that means 90% of proposals submitted to the NCI are simply rejected. It's a heartbreaking moment because, of course, as we discussed, it takes a lot of time, a lot of efforts, often a lot of really ownership goes into those proposals, and seeing them rejected can be really devastating. But of course, receiving a grant award is very fulfilling, very exciting, and that means the work is not just beginning.
Absolutely. I have known those heartbreaking moments. I'm also one of those people that even if I'm rejected, I revise and resubmit, and I revise and resubmit, which is always an option with these grants where you get that critical feedback from the peer review and you resubmit. But it's this constant process, right, where we're thinking and writing and thinking and writing and thinking and writing. Mm-hmm. Thanks for bringing this graphic, Denis. I think it's really helpful in understanding kind of the breadth of how these grants live, that each one of them follows a similar path in this life cycle. But it doesn't just end once you have that NOAA or notice of award, right? If we look in this flow chart, there's definitely then the time to actually do the research, right? Which is kind of the fun part, what we look forward to. But there are also progress reports. There's monitoring and a closeout. So what are these progress reports?
right? They can be quite expansive. So federal grant awards require numerous statutory and regulatory requirements. The agency often requires regular reporting through performance metrics. You have to state, if you've published your work, if you patented intellectual property, budget reports, reviews to prevent fraud and abuse. You work with a grant program officer typically, or will help you manage this award. It's designated by the agency itself to fulfill those requirements. So once the grant ends, you must complete a closeout with final reports. Again, can be very expensive document. And the agency confirms the work is complete and all requirements are received.
It's a long process, and this is just the process for one single grant, but oftentimes, depending on your institution, you're bringing in multiple grants at a time and surviving off of that, where you're paying portions of your salary, you're paying for your staff, for the research, for the equipment, all of these different things. So Denis, tell me, at any given moment, how many grants do you have?
Well, several, and not because I'm greedy. I simply do not have a choice, right? If different grants will start and end at different point in times, and they may not simply be large enough to test the important hypothesis you may have in developing a new treatment for cancer, for instance. So there can be gaps in funding, and that's another moment where, as a researcher, you sweat bullets, right? Where you may lose highly trained research staff, lose postdocs who you may have taken years to train and who are now at the peak of the productivity, and simply because the grant you have is finishing, may not accomplish the work that we delineated. Hence, the critical importance of typically having multiple grants. So typically, researchers will have those grants at any one time, and really are constantly looking for new opportunities to fund their ideas and work.
It's really more of an entrepreneurial spirit that comes with this process, with this game of grant writing, right? You're kind of constantly trying to build, but then also maintain that team. I mean, even the most senior, most established researchers experience gaps in funding. It's just the name of the game. So it's a tough process. And to be successful in it is really a tricky thing to do, which requires not just very high level of critical thinking and clear communication in writing, but also sometimes just luck, right?
Yes,
and pushing it through.
I've seen Nobel Prize winners being declined in the grant proposals, and the word you use of entrepreneurs, it's so on point. We all run a small company with staff, with research and administrative staff. We have to support ourselves, and it's constant battle in a very competitive landscape that we have to negotiate. So the way to think of Hopkins is a collection of small and sometimes big companies working along very tough lines they have to toe. So yeah, good word there, good characterization.
And always mission driven, right? Those proposals that get you the dollars have specific aims and hypotheses that you have to convince your peer review and your agency that is valuable science to improve the lives of people, typically, or work to improve something in our planet that will ultimately improve the lives of people. So as part of your job as the Vice Provost of Research, I bet you have a very good idea of the amount of federal research dollars earned by Johns Hopkins faculty. So can you tell us kind of the scale of success these Johns Hopkins researchers have in the process of competing for this funding?
Well, I'm a lucky and proud VP for research, because now for 41 years, Johns Hopkins has led the nation in research and development spending. So according to the National Science Foundation, Johns Hopkins spent a staggering $2.917 billion in FY 2019. Johns Hopkins RD was number one in federal funding expenditures at $2.482 billion. We've been number one, but that's, of course, makes it a bit of a target. And accordingly, I've set up processes at Hopkins to keep our faculty at the cutting edge of the work they can do and really ensure they can accomplish these lofty and ambitious goals they set for themselves. 85% of Johns Hopkins R&D expenditures actually come from the federal government. We receive funding from many agencies, more than 30 actually. Our top funders include the National Institute of Health, NIH, the USDA, US Agency for International Development, the Department of Defense, the Center for Disease Control, CDC, the NSF, National Foundation, and on and on.
So Cybele, let's bring you back in here for a minute. Does the federal government increase the share of federal expenditures that go towards research at institutions of higher education like Johns Hopkins? Or do all researchers compete for kind of a similarly sized share of federal expenditures just year after year after year?
So in an ideal world, the federal budget, at least on the discretionary side, is growing by some reasonable amount, reflecting growth in the economy and other factors. And therefore the pie is growing slightly bigger. Whether it's enough to meet the needs is another story. And frankly, in recent years, we've had different budget restrictions, budget caps, and other mechanisms that have sort of artificially constrained that growth. So fiscal year 19 was the first time in 10 years that there was a modest increase in the federal share of R&D expenditures available to the institutions of higher education. This is still the second lowest share since the national survey began in 1953. The nation currently spends about 0.7% of GDP on science and technology. We'd love to see that doubled to 1.4 to get closer to where we were in some of our national moments of science history. And we need the federal government to continue increasing investments in science and technology so that research can lead to the innovation and discoveries that are needed to meet the challenges of our changing world. So it's a work in progress, but we are feeling optimistic with the skinny budget that was presented by the Biden administration and just the bipartisan interest, I think, in rising to the research needs of the world through our research infrastructure here at home.
So Denis, if the federal government does start to increase the spending in the area of research and science, is Hopkins going to be prepared for any challenges that might arise on the academic institutional side of things when it comes to kind of continually engaging in these federal processes? Because of course, when a part of the process changes in any kind of moment, then the institution has to respond, correct?
Absolutely. There are really many steps in this process, and they unfortunately evolve over time. For instance, the instructions for each step and each piece of the application we've been talking about tend to be very detailed, from page limit to text font size to contents. So any change to the application process has typically a huge impact on individual investigators and the institutions, right? We have some 4,500 faculty at Johns Hopkins University, multiply just adding an hour or two to the process, typically more, and now you multiply that by 4,500, at least if it's just one application per year, is not so estimate. So a huge impact on institutions. So this impact can range from a learning curve, of course, for the investigator, to major structural changes as to how to support the grant application process. So at the end of the day, the institution submits the grant on behalf of the investigator, so that the research administration teams are responsible for being on top of such changes.
So, Cybele, Johns Hopkins is definitely a private, not-for-profit entity, but it clearly works hard for federal funding. Why are these public-private relationships and partnerships so important to move research forward?
So Johns Hopkins was established in 1876 as the nation's first research university. And we've grown since then in our mission. Our motto is to actually provide knowledge for the world. And it's a mission that parallels contributions made by the United States to meet global challenges. Our faculty, experts, and research infrastructure rely heavily on federal funding, as Denis discussed, each of them earning their grants through a competitive process. Conversely, federal agencies have wonderful scientists on staff, and they conduct what's called intramural research, but they can't possibly conduct all of the research that's needed to answer these pressing questions in-house. And so the federal government and US universities formed a partnership during and after World War II based on the mutual interest of advancing research and providing service to the nation. And this symbiotic relationship has been phenomenally successful. You also have private industry in the mix, funding research wholly outside of the government at those companies and working increasingly with universities and others to tackle pressing questions. But I think with the breadth of questions before the world, we really need to be drawing best and brightest from everywhere to that mission. And unless you wanted to vastly increase the size of government employees and try to bring everybody in-house, it's just not feasible to do that in that way. And so this partnership where there's a constrained process set up, governed by Congress and the administration around the level of funding, the expectations of funding, the priorities of the federal funding, allows institutions like ours with our faculty and our peer institutions to go in and compete for it. And you really need that jigsaw puzzle approach of public and private engagement to lead to the discoveries that we have today. I mean, we can have anybody, talk about the development of the mRNA technology that's fueling two of our critical COVID vaccines, and that's those partnerships come about that way.
Well, thank you both. This has been just a comprehensive overview of the process from appropriations of those federal dollars all the way to how the research is funded and how it's monitored. Those funds are monitored after awarded. So I really appreciate it. And if you guys are up for it, I'd love to just take a few questions from the audience. Sound good?
Sure.
Okay. So Cybele had just mentioned, the need to kind of continue to draw the best and the brightest, and that calls on what we term early stage investigators, right? So these are people who are a little bit more junior, kind of starting into this game of funding from the federal agencies. And the question is, how do you advise an early stage investigator as they're just starting to submit proposals for federal funding? Do you have any advice, Denis?
Well, let me state that early career faculty are the future of science and technology for the nation. And if we fail to not only recruit, keep and fund those early career faculty, they'll go elsewhere. They're gonna have options, and that's bad news for the future of science and technology in this country. The best defense is offense, right? And the best offense is to push the envelope technologically and scientifically beyond science and technology, also in the social sciences and humanities. So that's the first statement. So my advice to early career faculty is to try to associate themselves with a mentor. Someone they can work with, they can get, to celebrate achievements, but also maybe get some tough love when, it's time to maybe decouple your efforts to secure federal funding. And a last advice is try often. The best correlator in securing funding is the number of proposals you're submitting. Of course, you have to be good enough because exactly as Kerry pointed out, right? You receive these reviews back and you've been turned down. After the heartbreak, the recovery, you ask yourself, how can I refine my message? How can I refine my hypothesis? And it takes stamina, it takes support, it takes that mentorship. Surround yourself with people who can support you. This is what kind of first piece of advice I'd have for early career faculty.
Thanks for that. Cybele, we have one for you. The question is, how challenging is it to work with so many different agencies on so many different topics? I imagine as the Vice President for Federal Strategy, you are quite busy.
Well, we have a team, thankfully, but it's not a very large team. And again, I feel like we have such talented faculty that we work with. They keep an eye on the things that matter to them as well. So there's a constant conversation with our faculty and with the federal agencies and with the committees to see what's developing out there that we need to be working with. I think to just piggyback a little bit on what Denis was speaking about for our early investigators, I will tell you I had a call just before this event this morning with one of the leaders in Congress who's working with us on research relief. And this is an effort we're undertaking to help get some supplemental funding to fill in the gaps that have been caused by the pandemic pause. So when we de-densified the labs last year and had to stop a lot of clinical trial enrollment because of the pandemic, it's created this gap in productivity. We're looking for funding to help support that, but we're also looking for flexibility with the agencies to, for example, help our early career investigators extend the duration of preferential status that they have when they're getting off the ground. So there are a lot of tools, even aside from funding itself, that can be used to try to support our early career people. And something like that, speaking of going across agencies, is something that we're trying to work with at a macro level on the administration side so that we don't have tremendous variability, so that a researcher, a scientist who's working with NIH has the same opportunities as a DoD funded researcher, not necessarily in terms of budget, that's all different, but around flexibilities in grant administration that, our folks who work on that side of the house would love to see more consistency across agencies. But we also recognize there are certain peculiarities inherent in each agency's work. So there's going to have to be some variation, but the more we can find a consistent approach, the more streamlined the process can be while still maintaining, rigorous peer review and other oversight conditions.
And Denis, another question for you. The grant process seems to be quite complex, as we've just explained it, and it can take time from both the individual investigator, but also it employs people full-time to actually help administer the application process and then submit the grant. So just kind of in your experience, how do researchers balance this time needed to secure the funding with the time needed to do the science that's funded?
And keep the sanity in the process. Carrie, this is the primordial challenge. That's, by the way, not the only task these faculty expect to do. They expect to do teaching, advising, mentorship, participate in committees at the university. So it's a very rich portfolio of activities that they have to juggle. And unfortunately, the time they spend on writing proposals, because the level of funding is so low, 10%, for instance, for cancer research, they spend too much time on those proposals and less time on actually doing the research. To take a pause and think about the questions, think about the approach they'd like to utilize to test the hypothesis, be by the side of the student and fellows to mentor them, to have those so important conversations about the result at hand, about how to analyze them, how to think about it. So it is estimated that faculty spend about 30% of their time just writing proposals. The only solution is really to increase funding and to really allow for this amazing talent to be actually used to accomplish those scientific goals. This is the only thing I can say. Unfortunately, it is right now, you could call it the crisis we facing as scholars, is too much time spent chasing money instead of actually doing the work. What a great question.
It's a great question. I know that, and your amount of time that you spend on chasing grants does change over the course of your career, right? It does go up and down, but particularly as you continue to be more and more senior and your team is big, you are constantly chasing grants to make sure that you can continue to support. Well, we will be answering a few more questions that are coming in from the chat through Twitter and other mechanisms, social media, after we conclude, but we did want to kind of wrap things up today and make sure everybody gets a little extra time in their day. So as we wrap up, I want to be sure we have really a good idea of the impact of these federal dollars. Do you have a measurement, either Denis or Cybele, about the impact of the federal funding earned by Johns Hopkins faculty? Denis, maybe start with you.
Yes, well, the impact can be local, but also global. The impact you're seeing numbers here can be, measured in many different ways. It starts with economic impact, of course, and it can be, in the city of Baltimore, Johns Hopkins is the largest employer of the city of Baltimore. It's also the largest employer of the state of Maryland after the federal government. But the impact of Hopkins, the impact of research in general, is felt, of course, way beyond it. I would like to highlight the fact that the majority of new technologies, new treatment, new antibacterial treatment, new vaccines developed in the private sector comes from inventions and scientific research done at universities. And so the impact of a faculty can be felt in many different ways. Carrie, who's too modest to say so I'll say it on her behalf, has also huge impact on policymakers, right? Public health experts have never had so much impact in this pandemic. That was because they were training their skills and homing the communication skills included to, in a way, prepare for this crisis. Not that they wanted to see it, but no, they were incredibly well positioned to be so contributing to that. So it's also helping in policy making. So many different ways research can impact. And again, pick up your cell phone, just about any app, just about any piece of hardware that make up that cell phone comes from academic research.
So I'd say, I think it is really important to put in perspective how federally funded research not only advances the ideas and innovation and discovery that Denis was just talking about, but it's an economic engine in and of itself for, certainly for the state of Maryland, which is our, where most of our footprint is, but for California, for a number of other states. Actually, there's research dollars go to every state. It's just to different degrees depending on the universities in those states. And so, we've seen some estimates that say every dollar of federally funded research generates maybe $2 to $2.50 in economic activity. That's, we're waiting for an updated metric there. And I think in FY19, we estimate that Johns Hopkins and our affiliates directly and indirectly accounted for more than $12.6 billion in economic output in Maryland and over 100,000 jobs. So as Denis mentioned, we're the largest private sector employer in the state of Maryland, including, if you include our operations in Washington, DC and Florida, we're a total economic impact of nearly 14 billion and more than 114,000 jobs. So there's, not only are the federal dollars supporting important research and work to advance society, it's also a critical part of the economic economy.
Wow.
In many states, the number one and largest employer of that state is an academic institution and the academic hospital. Incredible
impact that research institutions have all over their country and really all over the world. And, this is what we're going to be highlighting in the upcoming sessions of Hopkins on the Hill at Home. We are going to introduce you to the team that will be crashing equipment into an asteroid in attempts to move it off course and hopefully protect our planet in the future from coming in contact with an asteroid. We're going to go inside the biocontainment unit at Johns Hopkins Hospital, which was developed to help treat individuals with Ebola, and now is kind of the center, the heart of the Johns Hopkins COVID response. And then we'll look at how some investigators are predicting flash droughts in order to protect our food supply, as well as the effect of heat islands on food supply and health around those communities. And then finally, we will conclude our Hopkins on the Hill 2021 with the team of the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Dashboard, which has informed our understanding of the coronavirus pandemic since the very, very early days. We hope that you will be in attendance with us at all of these upcoming weekly Hopkins on the Hill events. We hope that you will enjoy them, and we hope to see you next week. Be well, and bye for now.